Welcome to another live stream on History by Podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Markus Vinzent. And today we're going to be discussing Marcion and the formation of the canonical Gospels and when the Gospels were written. And before we continue, I have the link to Patristica, a Jack Bull's YouTube channel. Markus appears on there very often, along with Mark Bilby. And the link to it is tagged in the description below. It will also be in the pinned comment just below that. And that being said, Markus, thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me again. Yeah.
So why are there so many different solutions for the synoptic problem? Is the synoptic problem unresolvable?
I think when in scholarship you have a great diversity where scholars for 120 years, probably longer, have pondered on a particular problem, came up with different solutions, and despite all efforts, cannot agree, which in this case is the case. Then it is time to reflect upon the problem as such and no longer look into further polishing up and putting together more details, but think of a fundamental problem in the approach that has been taken so far. And I think because the synoptic problem has not been solved, we have solutions, but scholars cannot agree. There are this Farrer, Goodacre, Michael Golder scenario where you dispense of Q. But then they all think, at least a number of people think, that Mark has priority over the others. But then the question is, Q can only be reconstructed if Matthew and Luke have not been conflated. Because as soon as you put a link between Matthew and Luke, you lose the independence of the witnesses. Hence, you can no longer drag out of two independent witnesses a third document, the source of the two. So here comes the whole mess. And the whole mess, I think, has been created by a fundamental mistake, not by scholars, but by the approach. And the fundamental mistake is that the synoptic problem so far, one has tried to resolve what I call a genealogical approach, which means there is a gospel A, which is the origin. And there is a gospel B and C and D and probably 100 more, maybe 50 more, that are all dependent on these earlier ones. So you get like grandfather, father, son, or grandmother, mother, daughter, and so forth, the offsprings. But I think that's the fundamental problem. So it's the riddle to think which gospel comes first, which comes second, third, and fourth. That's the mistake, I think. I've myself made the same mistake because I was thinking in the same kind of model in the beginning when I approached the problem. And when I thought of inverting the order between Luke and Marcion's Gospel, at the same time when people, for example, like Matthias Klinghardt and others, like Jason Bedu and even Judith Lühe a bit later, followed this type of inversion. And because they have worked with these texts, because other synoptic scholars usually dispense themselves of working with Marcion's Gospel, so they just look at those four. But those people who have engaged with Marcion's Gospel, with the various slightly diverting and differing reconstructions of it, but all of those people who have engaged seriously with this text came up with the same solution to say Marcion's Gospel came first. So I instigated this too and joined the group of scholars from the 19th century and also my colleagues who I just mentioned. Now, I still see that the relation between Marcion's Gospel and Luke's Gospel is the way that has been described by those scholars who have looked into Mass and scholars gospel. However, I think there is the danger to fall into the same kind of mistake that the synoptic scholars so far have done. When I reconstructed over the past 4 or 5 years, together with my team, Mark Bilby, Jack Bull, Lance Laythorpe, the 10 letters of Paul, it became clear that these 10 letters give us a better insight, something we don't have when we just look at the Gospels. But these letters give us a fantastic insight into the making and into the developing of these letters as collections. And they let us know that apparently we are dealing in the making of these collections with 2 schools. There is this one school, and the school is running for several years. There is this one school which is headed by Polycarp of Smyrna, which is in Asia Minor. Irenaeus tells us that his teacher, so he is belonging to this school, but as a student first, that his teacher Polycarp is giving lectures in the Emperor's Basilica that can only be in Ephesus, as people have shown. And this school apparently is running from the early days of Irenaeus. That must have been around the middle of the 2nd century, maybe even a few years earlier. And then Irenaeus grows from there. He has also a co-student. And this co-student, he corrects because he thinks this co-student is a Valentinian, or is at least somebody who is not only listening to his own teacher in the same class, in the class of Polycarp, but he has clearly leniencies towards the Valentinian ideas. So here we encounter a first fringe, or even a first unsharpness of a school. So we should not think of schools as closed entities. Schools are always open because students join them. Students move from school to school, as for example, Josephus tells us in his youth. The same thing we have Justin Martyr. He moves from school to school. And very similarly, we have to think of the school of Polycarp not as an orthodox institution, but as an open school, which is attended by Valentinians as much as by other people. But this is certainly one of the most important schools in the 2nd century. Then we have other schools. I've just mentioned the Valentinians. Although we know very little about Valentinus, who has been called a Gnostic, not because he was a Gnostic in our sense today. No, Gnostic people are people who are teachers, who want to know something. And Clement of Alexandria quite easily calls himself a Gnostic. As, for example, Justin Martyr wears the philosopher's coat and thinks of himself as a philosopher who pursues the truth and knowledge, which is called in Greek gnosis. So he's a Gnostic himself. So we should not think again in terms of the heretics that are the Gnostics and the Orthodox, who are not Gnostics. Far from it. We have schools that interact with each other and who are, in the movements, but also osmotic, where people come in and go out. So we have the school of Polycarp as one of the most important ones. Then Valentinus, apparently a very important school himself, directed in Rome. We know of Justin Martyr, who tells us that he is coming from Asia Minor, or first of all from Palestine, Samaria, moving to Asia Minor, where he has this debate staged with Trypho the Jew. And apparently, if his martyrdom is in this respect reliable. He has a school in Rome. It says he's teaching up on the first floor above the bath, a public bath. So we have a third school, and then we have a fourth school, the Didaskaleon, which, according to Clement of Alexandria, was run by Marcion. So we have several schools, some in close relations, like in the city of Rome, but then also schools in Asia Minor, Polycarp, and I'm not talking about the schools. We could add the school of Basilides in Alexandria and many more. I've just mentioned the most important ones for our synoptic problem. So the first fundamental mistake, I think, in not solving the synoptic problem is to put these gospels into one line of a genealogy, so that B comes after A, C comes after A and B, and D after A, B, C. There is a second major mistake, I think, which distorts the problem, and that's why the problem can't be solved, not on the principles that we have deployed so far. And this is that these Gospels, since the 19th century, have been related to communities, to liturgy, to the normal public, but not to schools. But only the connection with schools will help us solve the problem. And there are a number of indications that these texts have little to nothing to do with communities, but primarily with schools. It's always been a big riddle why the Christians who write these texts do it in the format of a codex. But then papyrologists have taught us in the meantime that it is typical that codices are being used in schools. You know, these wax tablets. These were used for the ordinary use. But to put a wax tablet together with several layers and to replicate that in papyrus or in vellum, that gives you a working product where you can slip forward and backward, as we do with reading books today. Why do we use books and not scrolls any longer? Scrolls are ideal for communities. They are ideal for worship. They're ideal for a liturgical reading because you read sections by section and you know exactly where you have stopped last week and where you continue next week. But the moment you sit around, listen to a teacher, and try to follow what he is explaining, where he makes links to other texts, to other books, it's much more convenient to have a codex on your legs. That's why I think it is one hint, but there are more hints than that, which tell us that these products were products of schools. Now, if we take now the models together, which I explain, that schools are amorph and not segregated, that schools interact, because teachers interact, just as we do today. I'm reading anybody's book on subjects that are related to my research. And particularly do I read those things of colleagues who criticize my own thinking and who make suggestions, quite often brilliant suggestions. When I engage with those, I change my mind. One of these experiences was that I noticed that my own approach was so boxed into the old framework that I was also thinking about a first gospel of which then the others were dependent. I think that was a grave mistake. It is a much better framework, which derives now from the reconstruction of the Pauline letters, to think in various schools and entrepreneurs. Heidi Wendt called that these learned entrepreneurs of the second sophistic. Much better idea, much better project than the one I suggested before. How does it work? I start with the product I know. Much better because it gives us more background and hints than the gospel material, as I said. Pauline letters, as we have them in the Marcionite collection, and this is not the earliest collection, so it's not the earliest letter state, but it's the last one, the earliest one, I'd say, that we can reconstruct for the moment. And that doesn't mean that every letter collection in the future is dependent on it, just on this one. No, it shows that Marcion's letter collection of Paul's letters, the 10 letter collection itself, goes back and has 2 earlier collections that it makes use of. And here it becomes already very interesting, because the study of this earlier collections in Marcion's collection shows that one of those 2 collections that he makes use of, a collection of 3 letters, particularly interesting because it is these are the 3 letters that today in scholarship are called the Deutero-Paulines. So today, Ephesians in Marcion's collection, it's called the Laodiceans, then 2 Thessalonians and Colossians. These 3 letters, Marcion apparently derived from, which I think we can show, from the Polycarp school in Asia Minor. This is the first crossover. We could call it contamination, or just the embracing of the material of another competitive but also interesting school. So he brings this material from Polycarp school and integrates it into his collection. The second part of the older texts that he gets is also a collection already. It's a collection, presumably, of 7 letters. We don't know yet. We might find out, but we don't know yet from which school he derives that collection. Maybe from one of the ones I've mentioned, but we need to see further in this. Now, if we apply the same model to the Gospels, then we can assume that the earliest reconstructible Gospels that we have, and these are indeed the Gospel of Marcion, and then soon after, the earlier forms of our synoptic Gospels, including John. We can assume that Marcion also, for creating this Gospel, must have, or seems to have, made use of earlier collections. Because if he is constructing his Pauline collection on the basis of collected material, he might have done the same for the Gospel. And that opens up a wide avenue. If we now also roll over the same model, he might have got certain materials from the same school of Polycarp. He might have borrowed material from another school, maybe the Valentinian school. He might have borrowed material from further afar. There could have been some source like you, there could have been, but all these materials seem to be school materials. And then, going back to the Pauline model, Marcion's 10-letter collection, that I think the reconstruction will show, has moved back into Polycarp school. They must have known that Marcion had put together a gospel and also 10 letters. And the first thing these schools do is they replicate the material. They rewrite these materials for their own students, but in their own minds. Hence, they do exactly what we do, scholarly precision. That's why it's becoming synoptical gospels, with scholarly precision, with an admiration for what's been done before, but also with care. They adopt the materials to their own needs and their own views. And this is why these texts are closely related. Now, it seems to me that unlike the 10 letters of Paul, which become remodeled as Polycarpian 10 letters of Paul, they were sticking together as a collection because they got it as a collection of 10 letters from Marcion, who got himself the letters in 2 collections of 3 and 7. So here we are in a collection environment. The Gospels do not seem to have been aggregated into a collection prior to Irenaeus. So we are dealing with individual Gospels. They have their particular notion. However, a major further step comes in. The school of Marcion seems to have known, or more than seems, because Tertullian gives us the preface, at least in content that Marcion writes. And this is the response, and that's also why we get to know about these processes, because Marcion responds to 4 Gospels, 2, as he says, that have been given names of apostles, and 2 who have been given names of students of apostles. Hence, we have our 4 later called canonical Gospels: Matthew, John, Luke, and Mark. And he reacts to these 4, calls them plagiarisms of his own gospel. Of course, he doesn't say that he himself has borrowed from others. So when he says that they are plagiarizing, it's not a substantial criticism, because he might have done the same before. At least in the case of Paul, he did so. These criticisms in his preface, I think, are the only reason why Irenaeus later makes a big statement, particularly in criticizing Valentinus and in criticizing Marcion, for having criticized these 4. And that's the reason why he favors these 4, because they come from around or within his own Polycarpian school, and defends them against Marcion's gospel. So he claims, because they are apostolic and not Marcionite, those are the 4 which we should have. Not 1, not 2, 4. What we have to, and how we have to think about John's gospel, we might discuss that a bit later. At the moment, we are about the synoptic question. So I think, to sum up, instead of having a genealogy, and instead of having these gospels deriving from some communities, we have an interchange between several schools in Asia Minor and in Rome, out of which a process derives of giving and taking. And this culminates in the rewriting of those texts by Marcion, then in the Polycarp school first, then Marcion reacts again, brings the New Testament together, solidifies his collection. And against this solidified collection, in the times of Irenaeus, the Polycarpian school puts together also its collection, now broadened, not only 10 letters, but 14 letters. Not one gospel, but those 4 criticized ones. In addition, a very important work for this new entity of 27 books is the Book of Acts. And with the Book of Acts, also the so-called Catholic letters, which means the letters to James or by James, the letter by Jude, the letter of Peter and of John. So the most important entities of the Jerusalem community. And then to finish off that collection, the Revelation of John. Yes, there were more texts out, but these were the texts that the Polycarp school, as we can see from Polycarp's letter to the Philippians, but also from the texts that are used by Irenaeus and proposed as the real ones, the best ones, and later picked up by Eusebius in reading Irenaeus, have been suggested as the most solid ones that have been accepted. Of course, in Eusebius's mind, schools are no longer relevant, but it is more the communities. But to roll this model back caused all the problems. And that's why we could not solve the synoptic problem until today. And I think with a fresh view, we might be able to solve the synoptic problem.
It's often pointed out and believed that Mark is the simpler of the Gospels, and that Matthew, Luke, and John all used Mark. So when you look at Mark's Gospel, what do you see in it? What is does because there are different arguments about Mark. Sometimes some people believe that Mark conflated Matthew and Luke with the Grisback hypothesis instead, because Mark looks like a zigzag. Like sometimes in the same verse, half of that verse will agree with Matthew, the other half will agree with Luke sometimes. What do you make of situations like that?
Well, that's a perfect example that you give, right? If you take away this idea that B comes after A and C comes after B and A, then the problem you've just mentioned is easily to be solved. If, first of all, the synoptic gospels, and in some respect even John, if they come from schools that are closely related to each other, maybe the John school a bit less related than the three synoptic texts, which derive from maybe three students of the same school. That explains when you sit next in the classroom and you look after your neighbor's shoulder and see what he is writing, and then you suggest your writing, then you might borrow a sentence from him, he might borrow a sentence from you. And the third one takes away both. First half this one, second half this one. As soon as we let's say assume at least that these texts were written in close physical location and in time, then we can explain the problems much better. And the first part of your question was, of course, Mark seems to be the simpler version. Yeah, I mean, if you've got a classroom, yeah, the teacher, let's say Polycarp sets out, for example, he knew Marcion and he didn't like him too much, but apparently the text was usable. If he were to teach from that text and makes his suggestions of changes, the views he has that differ from this text, and if three students follow that lecture, you end up with three synoptic gospels. Each takes away the teacher's criticism and lectures in a different way. That might be an explanation.
So now I'd like to ask about the early patristic witnesses to Marcion's gospel. Do you see a difference in what they say about Marcion's gospel from later witnesses? Especially given what you've noted before, that Irenaeus seems to contradict himself and kind of apparently admit that Acts came after Marcion's antithesis.
Yeah, I've stated that because that derives, if one reads Irenaeus versus Hereses very closely. But I think what we can take from the early witnesses, first of all, before Irenaeus, nobody has ever suggested that Marcion is tampering with any text. Irenaeus doesn't, Justin doesn't say so, Polycarp doesn't say it, nobody says so. And in addition, putting together texts, harmonizing text, dealing with these texts, nobody criticizes. Not in the 2nd century, not before Irenaeus. For example, that Tatian, a student, sometimes called a student of Justin Martyr, sometimes even of, in some sense at least, given the ascetic tradition of Tatian, sometimes even called a student of Marcion. He seems to have put together his own gospel, not 4, but 1. Do you know of any criticism in the 2nd century? I don't know of any single word. Very similarly, maybe Theophilus has put together a certain harmony. No criticism whatsoever. And when it comes to the Gospel of Peter, we know from the fragment, the bigger fragment that we have of this text, it is a harmony. It is indeed a harmony of not only the synoptics, but also of all four Gospels. And when Serapion visits the community, which apparently then has used this text, I don't think the text derives from there. It derives from a school, but then the text has been used by this community. Serapion, in the later 2nd century visits, he has no criticism. The criticism comes later when he hears that people debate about this text and see in this text, in their interpretation, that there are differences in the community. Then the debate starts and Serapion goes back on that question. But originally, I think, it just gives us the picture that we would have expected. In the 2nd century, people create these texts, and we are only talking now a few of them. We would be able to talk about many more. They create these texts, and there is little criticism. Hence, we are not surprised that there is no criticism of Marcion's text. No, on the contrary, I think, as all these people, the writer of the Gospel of Peter, just like Tatian, Theophilus, and we could name a few more, they make use of these texts. They rewrite these texts in their own sense. They borrow from each other. They learn from each other, and they criticize each other. So this is the portrait which we get. And even we have, for example, a report by Rodo is given in Eusebius's church history, where he describes how these schools develop. And you can clearly see how important school traditions in the 2nd century are. And that's why there is no criticism of Marcion. Even more importantly, we notice that whenever Tertullian, just as a few years earlier, Irenaeus, so we are always talking about the years between 170 something and, let's say, the beginning of the 3rd century. Whenever these authors mention and talk about the New Testament, they exclusively have in mind Marcion's collection. It will take years until the big collection of 27 books, as we know it today, becomes known under the name of the New Testament.
When you look at Marcion's gospel and how it relates to the canonical gospels, do you see multiple steps taking place in between? Meaning like rather than direct dependence, indirect independence through redacted text that may have been lost?
I think we can. If the model that I'm suggesting comes close to what happened, and this is, as we all know, these are suggestions and hypotheses. It is that Mark's gospel, for example, Matthew, Luke as well, and John seem to have at least 2 redactional states or levels between Marcion's text and the text that Irenaeus knows. The first step is that they seem to have been written whether using other material, which we could imagine, just like Marcion has used. That's why we have these typical special material from Luke, special material from Matthew, special material from John. But I think the 2 major levels that existed was when Marcion plus these other materials I just mentioned were integrated and became a different gospel from that of Marcion, namely a gospel of Mark. Whether Mark was, again, 1st, 2nd, 3rd is irrelevant. I guess these texts were written in a short period of time in parallel. Mark has one or two elements very closely related to Marcion's gospel. So whether Marcion's gospel also had a pre-version of Mark is possible, or whether Mark is so similar to the gospel of Marcion because it relies directly on it, potentially yes. And the similarity is that Mark's gospel does not have a child story of Jesus. It starts at the same place with the adult Jesus where Marcion's gospel started. So no childhood, no young boy, nothing. An adult who comes into this world. It differs at that place by introducing John the Baptist. And I've tried to show in my book on Christ Torah a potential reason that Mark starts, not just with Jesus appearing in Nazareth or in Capernaum, but that there is instead a prior story to the Jesus story in Mark, which is a story about John the Baptist and Jesus. Why is that the case? Well, normally people say because historically it was the case. But that is quickly said. We are dealing with texts. And in the literary structure, I try in Christ Torah to read this as a literary device. Why? Because one of the core texts, one of the core ideas that Marcion's gospel embraces comes with Luke 16, 16 and 17. What does it say? That the law and the prophets, they lasted until John the Baptist. And that from that time onwards, the kingdom of heaven has been preached. So Marcion's gospel in this statement, which interestingly has been taken over by Luke, with this statement, he divides the history of Judaism into a Jewish past and an Israelite past, with the law and the prophets, of which the last prophet is reckoned to be John the Baptist. And the Christian period that also Marcion calls in his preface, Judaismos on the one side and Christianity on the other side. And here, with Christianity, the new time begins. That's why it's called the New Testament, because it is the new prophet, as he calls him. He says to him, he's the great prophet. With this great prophet starts the Christian time. And with the great prophet, he comes with a new testament that sets the Old Testament in its place. It sets it aside, which does not say it denigrates this text. No, it sets it aside because this form of religion that should be started, because it's new, has and is based on a new sort and collection of texts, on the gospel and Paul's letters. Because that was the strong sense of these texts, I think Mark has made the suggestion to use that figure of John the Baptist no longer to be the dividing person and the dividing line between old and new, but to show that old, the Israelite time, the prophets, Malachi, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and others, and the Torah, that these Israelite elements can be bridged and can be brought over to and into the new times of Christianity. And that's, I think, was a great idea. Whether it was by Mark or by Matthew, by Luke, or by John, we don't know. That would be something one would need to see. I think from the development of the personality that's being created in that history, it looks to me as if Mark might be the origin for that story, and that this has been reformulated by Matthew and Luke. Could be. But again, I don't want to create another genealogy now of stories, because they are so interlinked with each other, as you would have thought if these stories had been written in a school. And maybe it wasn't any of these three, but it was probably the teacher Polycarp himself who suggested those ideas. I don't know. But you can see Mark shares with Marcion's gospel that lack of the youth stories. And similarly, he lacks the ascension. So the end is a fuzzy end in Mark. It's not really an end with resurrection appearances. And we know that at a later stage, Mark's last chapter, 16, has been extended to also include resurrection appearances. Matthew and Luke develop birth stories and youth stories for Jesus, absent from Marcion's gospel. And it appears to me that when you look at what the witnesses give, particularly Marcion's preface himself or itself, he seems to know when he criticizes those four gospels, he criticizes already a rudimentary shape of a birth story. He knows of Bethlehem. He knows of the laying in the manger of the Lord. And he, according to Tertullian, he ridicules that. And if that's true, then we might see that what we are given by Matthew and Luke, and they have about 11 verses overlap between those youth stories or birth stories. There might have been an older first version which was created in the first step of when these Gospels, Mark, Luke, Matthew, and maybe John a bit later, have been created. However, I think we have to distinguish then further steps of, or at least one further step of reduction of these synoptic Gospels. And this second reduction comes around the times, maybe a bit earlier than Irenaeus writes. So I think in the late years of Polycarp, when the collection of the 27 books was put together. At that time, these Gospels have been re-redacted. Now in the light of Acts, now in the light of these Catholic letters, now in the light of the extended form of Paul's letters, and even in the light of Revelation. So we have met in a rough cut, I say, we have two reductions of the synoptics. One is around the years 140 and one around the 160, 65. John has a slightly different history because Irenaeus knows that Ptolemaeus has a version of John which is missing, for example, the incarnational part of the prologue. So it could be that John's gospel was written within the Valentinian school, of course, in interchange, as Marcion's text too, in interchange with the Polycarp school. And that from there, the Polycarp school took also this text, added this incarnational part, and integrated that text, because it was criticized by Pope Marcion too, integrated this text into their broader collection, which was brought together, if I'm not mistaken, in the 160s, and then heavily defended by Irenaeus.
Does Marcion's gospel remind you of the concepts in, surrounding Q, Lucas, and Markus?
This is a relatively new design that I'm proposing, based as a result of the insights that the reconstruction of the Pauline letters give. So I think there is more work to do to to distinguish between those elements where Marcion's gospel might go back to also earlier sources. So far, the most detailed study of these texts in their interaction with each other is Matthias Klinghart's reconstruction, and particularly his commentary, which is very, very detailed. And I think in light of what I was saying, one would need to read that again. And he has already seen so many elements where he believes and shows that if Mark, Matthew, and Luke, as well as John, I think, but John he is dealing a bit less with, go back to Marcion's gospel, that he can show. In which ways Marcion's gospel might have gone back to earlier collections, I think that's something we need to explore in the future. So stay tuned in this channel. More will come, but we are lacking the answer at the moment.
How do you look at the Gospel of John and its relationship to the other Gospels? And my second part to that question is, what is Papias' connection to John?
Papias seems to locate himself into the Johannine tradition and the Johannine school. He himself is no presbyter. He himself is no community leader. He writes books. He is one of those people, like people in the second sophistic, that write books. So he has written logia, commentary maybe on whatever the basis is that refers to. But he is clear in making statements about particularly these synoptic gospels. So we have a statement of him, at least what is reserved by Eusebius, that he knows the gospel of Mark. Then he makes a statement that he knows also of the gospel of Matthew. And if we take the prologue, and I know some have difficulties to know about this prologue on John, written by Papias, he also knows the gospel of John. Now, interestingly, naturally, I would say, because he locates himself in the school where the gospel of John has been created, he is rather skeptical, not dismissive, but skeptical about the value of Mark and Matthew. He says Mark somehow is a second-hand product. It's not an apostle's product. It's the product of somebody who had listened to the speeches of Peter. And he doesn't seem to be the most intelligent one because he doesn't even get the order of these discourses right. A pretty damn criticism, but no rejection. With Matthew has a different problem. He says, yes, he might have restored the order to some extent, but then it's again not a first-hand product. It's a translation. It's a translation from a Hebrew text, or at least he says, en dialecto Hebraidi. So in a Hebrew state, that was the text before, and then it was converted and translated into a Greek text. That's why I think he says so, probably because he couldn't explain better why the Greek of Matthew is not the most elaborate Greek. For people who have done philology, don't need to be a Papias to discover that Mark is not a fine Greek, but you might say, well, he was not the most educated person, so he doesn't get the order right. Matthew seems to be a bit more elaborate, and that shows also in the Greek, but it's not a great Greek. It's Koine Greek. It's the Greek that's being used by the ordinary people. But if you're a trained scribe, or more, if you're a person of literature, then you wouldn't write as Mark and Matthew does. I'll give you one example. Whenever we do an exam in our department, we usually use texts either by Matthew or Mark, and of course also by John, because they're just so much simpler in grammar, in lexicography, than the Gospel of Luke. And that explains already, because the Gospel of Luke is directly It's the closestly related to Marcion's gospel. It is the gospel with the best Greek writing. Next comes only the letter to the Hebrews. Those are the two texts in the New Testament, the canonical New Testament, which can claim to have some shining Greek. And however, Papias does not make any mention about the Gospel of Luke. Why? Is it chance that Eusebius doesn't give us a reference? But then it would also be chance that we have no other sources which report about Papias' use and knowledge, or at least acknowledgement of Luke. In the case of John, which is not given at that place where we have Eusebius' note on Mark and Matthew from Papias, on John we have the preface, which was becoming a preface of the Western Latin translation in their Vulgate books. And there, before the Gospels start, the so-called Marcionite prologues, or also sometimes anti-Marcionite prologues that existed, were transmitted in our manuscripts. Now, in some of these manuscripts, quite a number actually, we have a prologue which is being referred back to Papias. And where Papias, whichever way you want to read it, and you set the interpunction, is quite difficult because at the time people wrote without interpunction. But whichever way you translate or read this prologue, the prologue states that there is interaction between Marcion and John the Gospel writer, and that Papias reports about it. That sets the scene. A, Papias cannot have lived earlier than Marcion. B, John the Gospel writer can impossibly have written his Gospel prior to 100, even prior to 110. He must have engaged with Marcion, so we are in the years 140. Scholars had great difficulties with this prologue, and people like Harnack, they simply replaced the name of Marcion by other ones, which goes against all the manuscripts we have. We have not one single variant reading which does not give Marcion who engages with John and John with Marcion. All our manuscripts have the identical text in this respect. So why now Papias does not give us, or why a statement of Papias about Luke didn't survive? Again, I can only guess here. It's an hypothesis, but it might be a realistic one. If Papias was critical and skeptical about Mark, and if he was also critical and skeptical about Matthew, and if he only proposes John as the true gospel, as that prologue says, he might have been hyper skeptical about Luke's gospel because it is so closely related to Marcion's gospel. And I'm not just making things up. It's not a guess into the blue, on the contrary. Because when you read Tertullian's books against Marcion, you will see that he has a longer statement about the Gospel of Luke. And he laughs about Marcion, but that rhetorical laughter is displaying an internal criticism which supports the case which I've just made. Because Tertullian says, well, poor Marcion, you have chosen the worst of the Gospels to work on. Of course, he doesn't explain to us and doesn't give us that the Gospel of Luke depended on Marcion. He inverts that relation for his own apologetic claim. But he says, poor Marcion, why have you chosen of all the Gospels the worst one? And you can see it's a rhetorician, because even if Marcion had chosen Luke, it would have been the best one, at least in terms of Greek and literature. And he says, why is it the worst one? Well, poor Marcion, it's not a gospel by one of the apostles, so not Matthew and John. It's even not a gospel of the superhero of the apostles of Peter, hence Mark. What an idiot you are. You took the worst apostle, who, according to Acts, even isn't got an apostle. And then he makes this wonderful statement and says, what apostle have you taken? An apostle who only claims for himself that he is an apostle. Nobody else does it. But you need at least 3 or 4 witnesses. Normally, you need to have somebody who is it, who witnesses it, who writes it down into the register, and we have a whole phalanx of witnesses. You need to make a claim to be an apostle. All of that fails with Paul. Hence, he concludes, Marcion has chosen that text which can hardly be called a gospel. Yes, it's still integrated, but that doesn't really count. So what I'm just saying is, I think there is a good reason why a scholar like Papias, who comes from the school of John, has almost no say. If he had a say, probably he didn't. At least when you read the other witnesses from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, it could explain why there is silence about Luke's gospel in Papias. So let me sum up. I have, in my book on Christ Torah, I give all those sections who deal with this story of the prologue and how that story then becomes replicated by Origen, by later scholars. And it makes a whole history of that tradition, where we can see how the Gospel of Marcion, which in Irenaeus is still very present. He quotes it, he deals with it. Even he is the first, like unfortunately also the last, who reads Marcion's Gospel in a synoptic view, not only with our synoptic 3 texts, but with all 4 Gospels that he advocates. So you can see the confrontation which then happens in the late 2nd century between the one text by Marcion and those 4 texts that Irenaeus claims are the real ones. But when it comes to discussion, the synopsis is not a synopsis of 4 or of 3, but of 5. And I think our scholarship today would do very, very well if in all our synoptic discussions, or in our discussions of the 4 New Testament Gospels, we would always integrate the Gospel of Marcion. And just as a side step, whenever I look at Gospel traditions and discuss any pericope, I always look at all other Gospels as we know them, be it the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Jude, all of the Gospels. We always need to have the entire breadth of those early Christian gospel traditions. Otherwise, we should not write any commentary.
We have a super chat question from Daniel Bradford. Thank you for your super chat. Do you see connection with Shepherd of Hermas to the Gospels with the parables and themes of vineyards, fruit trees, rich, poor, watchfulness, etc.?
Daniel, very good question. Yeah, I do see these links. The problem is that we cannot date the Shepherd of Hermas. And the other notion that we have is there seem to be thematic overlaps. And I think, again, job for the future, we would need to see whether these relations between the Shepherd of Hermas exist with the earlier forms that are mentioned, the first redactional form of these 3 synoptic gospels, including also John, and also the Gospel of Marcion and the Shepherd of Hermas. I think that's something which hasn't been done so far. And I think one would need to start doing the parallels between the Shepherd of Hermas and the reconstruction of Marcion's Gospel. So that's a job which hasn't been done, but which has to be done. It is interesting that the same shepherd who has these thematic links that I also see, like you, that he has no apparent links, at least as far as I've seen, and other people too, to the 10-letter collection of Marcion, or even the 10-letter collection of the canonical tradition and the 14-letter collection. So how is it possible that the Shepherd of Hermas has these thematic connections with the synoptic traditions, potentially including the Gospel of Marcion, but not to Marcion's 10-letter collection, or then the canonical 10-letter collection later? You see, you're a good question, but unfortunately or fortunately, we need to come back and sit together to reflect upon that question which you have raised. And I think it's a most valuable question which needs to be pursued. Would be a fantastic PhD or a book in the future.
When you look at the Gospels that we have in their current forms, and also the absence of knowledge coming from hypothetical redactions or hypothetical documents that we cannot access, do you see a problem in the sense that, yes, there is probably a more complex solution to the synoptic problem, but that lack of knowledge can also complicate matters?
I hope that, any problem of the first and second and third centuries are complex problems, but that doesn't mean that we cannot solve any of these. We have hundreds, if not thousands, of colleagues around this globe who look into this matter. So I think we should come up with solutions and not just further complexities. The solution that I suggested and suggest today is not one of hypercomplexity. On the contrary, I think it cuts through those complexities by moving in two important steps away from the old framework. Instead of communities, we go for schools. Instead of dependencies, we go to interchanges. That's it. It's pretty that within these exchanges, we have then complex relations. This is not the creation of complexity, but when we look into the texts that we have as a fact and the text that we have as a result, they are complex in their relations. Hence, I suggest that the complexity is not because we are stupid. The complexity is in these texts because the relation between these texts were complex. But the model is simple.
So in other words, in a sense, the texts are using each other.
Precisely. And look, this is not rocket science. In all our manuscript traditions, also afterwards, in the 3rd century, in the 4th, and later until today, interdependencies are the norm. If you write something, you read more than one text. You read 3, 4 books, 10 articles, maybe more. Interdependency is part of our job. Knowledge is not created by sleeping well or lying in the bathroom and just come inspiration. No, you rely on others, on conversations like we do now, you and me. We do with a wider audience, with those super chat questions. These questions resonate with me and create knowledge. I'm dependent on you. This is what scholars are. We are not superheroes. No, we are not giants. Far from it. No, we are all co-workers. Those who listen, who speak, who raise questions, who bring things to the table, who write comments. I read those comments. And when I have something to answer, I do answer them.
And basically what you're trying to suggest is that the old paradigm of trying to say the Gospels depend on each other by saying each Gospel used what came before it, that doesn't really solve the problem. But if the Gospels are using each other simultaneously, that can better explain the data and why there's and why anyone can imagine any theory under the sun to solve the synoptic problems, because they're actually using each other.
You hit the nail on its head.
Daniel Kyle, thank you for your membership. Didn't Ignatius know of John? Did he write it?
That's a good question. Wow. Yeah, I mean, what I suggest is that the Ignatian letters, which have also a history of development, my suggestion that Jack Bull has picked it up and developed it in further detail, that these Ignatian letters also have a history. If Jack Bull is correct, then Romans and the letter to Polycarp have some individual lives before they were collected with the letter to the Ephesians in the three-letter collection. To that three-letter collection, we have some kind of a direct access or an indirect access through Syriac manuscripts. Jack knows much more about the Ignatian question than I do, but if I'm not mistaken, and he might correct me on the channel, that's how it states. And in these three letters already, there seems to be a Johannine connection, but it becomes even clearer a bit later. So yes, he might have belonged, and I think that shows in the text themselves, at least in the later stages, to that school. What is quite clear to me is that the 7-letter collection most obviously comes from the school of Polycarp. This we can show through stylistic similarities, topics, terminology is pretty straightforward, similar. There is a relation between the pastoral letters and the Ignatian letters that's always been seen. In Ignatius, you have this kind of slightly Gnostic terminology. And if I remind you of Thomas Lechner's work, who studied with the same supervisor that I did, he has shown that the Valentinian school of Markus, of Markus, seems to be behind the kind of theology that is being addressed in these Ignatian letters. The 3 already, and then a bit later, also in the other 4. So I think there is a relation with this school. And again, the Polycarpian school seems to have that kind of a relation also to the Johannine school. So I think the Johannine text may have derived from slightly outside that Polycarpian school, but it was integrated. And maybe we have to think in similar processes with the Ignatian letters. They may have derived from around the school, but then were also pulled in to the Polycarp school. And that's why Irenaeus mentions Ignatius, but not by name. And you can see there is somehow a bit of an awkward relation, apparently. He calls Ignatius one of us, but he doesn't mention his name. Why would he not mention his name? He mentions other names, yeah, but not this one. So it indicates, at least, yeah, a kind of a close but not overly close relation in the beginnings.
What do you make of the relationship between Paul's letters and the Gospels? Because some scholars will say that Acts and Paul's letters are independent of one another, or that Acts depends on Paul's letters, or it's the other way around. Paul depends on Acts. Do the Gospels?
Yeah.
No.
Because those are 2 questions, yeah?
Yeah.
How is the interrelation between Paul and the Gospels? And the second part is, how is the interrelation between Acts and Paul? If you take the Gospel question first, in earlier days, the relation between the Pauline letters and and the Gospels have been staunchly denied. There were a few voices in the 50s and 60s that claimed that there are closer relations between the letters of Paul and the Gospels. Those have been ignored for a long time. But in the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years, particularly with colleagues like my really dear friend Eve-Marie Becker and Oda Wischmeyer, they have put together 2 volumes on the relation between Paul and the Synoptic Gospels. And I think they have very, very strong evidence that there are relations. Now, how these relations in detail are to be disjoined and explained, we still, I think, are a bit too early, because these 2 volumes, like a few other articles that exist on the relation between, for example, Paul and Mark, particularly, I think we need to raise that question again in light of the 10-letter collection that existed in the collection of Marcion, but also the 10-letter collection that the Polycarpian school seems to have created pretty quickly, and of which we can get a sense, but still early days. I'm so sorry today in this podcast to point to future tasks, but this is work in progress as we sit here. Not because I'm denying that I did some mistakes a few years ago. On the contrary, we shouldn't be cautious in the sense of not saying what we think at that very moment. We should be cautious by making overstatements with regards to a hypothesis. I always try to indicate what I think I know from the facts which I have. And still, this is the interpretation which I give, and the distinction between those things where I can only guess or can raise and create a hypothesis, because there is no better way at the moment to explain a problem. So in this regard, we really have to look into the project's development in the next 3 to 5 years, because we need again to revisit what we have done in the relation between Paul and the Gospels, the Synoptics and John, by adding this reconstruction of the 10-letter collection that I have produced and our team is issuing at the end of this month, and then hopefully next year also in English. And then I hope that there will be more answers given to your questions. That relates again also to Acts and Paul. However, here we are in a slightly better situation, because Acts is clearly related only and merely to the 14-letter collection of Paul, which means to the canonical texts. There is no relation of Acts with the Marcionite Paul, unless one thinks that Acts, and I think there is good reason for it, that Acts tries to move the canonically reworked 10 letters of Paul even further away from the historical Paul, if there was a historical Paul, at least further away from Marcion's 10-letter collection. I can show you that, and I do that in the introduction also of the reconstruction. And I've submitted an English translation of my latest book, which appeared just 4 weeks ago. The title is From Paul to Saul. Why do I use and invert that relation? Because I wanted to show that there is a relation between the canonical Paul and this story in Acts. And the canonical Paul is clearly interrelated. Again, I don't think we should think of straight relation, whether the letters, the 14 letters, are earlier than Acts, or Acts is earlier than the 14 letters. Similarly, I think my suggestion is these texts are created in symbiosis. So in interrelation with each other, they seem to derive from the same school.
And when do you think the canonical Pauline epistles came out?
I think when they came out is one question. When they are conceived is easier to explain. Because when you read Polycarp's epistle to the Philippians, there you can see the development, that these 14 letters were just about to become in existence and are being proposed and used. Polycarp uses 4 times in his letter the sentence "a dotes hoti," knowing that. And then comes a quote. Twice he quotes, or once, the first quote comes from a Deuteropauline text, Ephesians. Second quote comes from a pseudo-Pauline text from one of the letters to Timothy. The third and the fourth quote come from canonically redacted. It's in both cases a mixture between 2 Pauline texts, of which one is always from a canonical redacted text alone. So all 4 texts show us, all 4 quotes show us that in Polycarp's letter to the Philippians, he makes a case for one new collection of Paul's letters, which is a combination of Pauline texts, Deuteropauline texts, and pseudo-Pauline texts, which he wants to be regarded all as texts by Paul. Dating. Dating of Polycarp's letter to Philippians is again slightly debated. The older dating, which is based on one reading of Eusebius, places it, particularly with regards to his martyrdom, into the 150s, 57 maybe. I think the more later dating into the times of Mark Aurel, again, can and has to be related to what Eusebius tells us, because he says in his chronicle that Polycarp lived to a high age, maybe 86, he says, and that he was murdered in the times of Mark Aurel. Now, Mark Aurel becomes emperor in 161. So scholars like, now skip my mind, but scholars today date, therefore, Polycarp's death in the 167, 68. It seems that his letter is being written while he was no longer a teacher, while he was already maybe retired, maybe Irenaeus had taken over, whoever was it. But that letter seems to revere a standing presbyter, so an older man. And so I think we are not too bad in dating this text in the 160s, which then would mean that these letters and that collection of the 14 letters has been created together with Acts and with the other letters in the years 160, whatever.
So we have a couple of more super chats, then we'll close. Daniel Kyle, thank you for your super chat. Gnostic circles claimed apostolic lineage. Did Christianity have different philosophical schools before the creation of orthodoxy?
Daniel, you are absolutely right. And when you say Gnostic circles, remember what I've said in the beginning. All schools were Gnostic circles. They all claimed gnosis is what makes people salvation. That's the philosophers' take in the 2nd century, irrespective which school they are. And therefore, before orthodoxy was created, and I would say Irenaeus is Polycarp maybe is the first attempt, but Irenaeus is clearly an attempt, the first attempt, according to scholars who are like Alain Boulouec, who have worked on the notion of heresy and the creation of orthodoxy, or take Bauer, the older study. With Irenaeus, we get close to then what develops into a kind of orthodoxy. But still, that takes so much time, because Tertullian later, claiming, of course, to be Catholic, then also moves away from the Roman Catholics, because he thinks there are only psychic people, but no spiritual people. So the real Christians and the real church he sees in the Montanists, in the Phrygian prophetesses. So you can see it's no easy going until we come to what we then later call orthodoxy. But the schools are earlier. And they're all Gnostic schools, if you like. Gnostic not in the negative sense, not in the exclusive sense, but in the interchangeable sense, as I try to argue. And don't forget Clement of Alexandria, when he runs his school in Alexandria, he calls himself a Gnostic. So people are running schools, and long and prior to anything that is orthodox. For example, also last word to that, when you see that Clemens also writes a book extracting fragments from Theodotus, he hardly criticizes him. He gives us a whole florilegium of this Gnostic school with whom he engages. So you can see, I hope I make my case clear, how important it is to think of the 2nd century as the cradle for Christian development in terms of schools that are interchanging and interrelated. And go to Heidi Wendt's fantastic book on religious entrepreneurs.
Solar Knight, thank you for your super chat. All human literature is fabricated from something.
Oh, this is so true, Solar. That's exactly what I try to argue today. It is what we have is human literature. And even if it were divine, it is literature. And it takes words, and it takes words from other words, and it remodels these and reconfigures it. That's what it is.
I'll have the links to Markus's books in the description below, including the Patristica team's latest book on the Apostolos reconstruction, the Greek-English edition, and also there's an English-only version of it that is out on Amazon for purchase. So if you want to get the Apostolos reconstruction, the link to it will be in the description below. And this, to be specific, it's called Apostolos Reader's Edition, Greek-English. That being said, Markus, thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, and thank you also for mentioning these books. It's a great team effort. And I also see appearing on History Valley as part of that team effort. Thank you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.